The gift is that it's all right to be quiet. It's okay to be a quiet person. You have many skills, and the biggest gift of all is thinking about things for longer than other people do. If only you get the space, to be able to do that. But I think people worry about being quiet, and actually don't lose your quiet nature. It's incredibly valuable. The world needs quiet people right now. It really does.
Season 4, Episode 3, Quiet People and Burnout, with Pete Mosley. Hello, Pete. Such a warm welcome to you to come on the podcast today with me. I'm so grateful of your time. And I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time now, since we've had so many different conversations about quiet people and the difference between quietness and introversion, and what it means to be a leader that appreciates and welcomes in quieter voices. So just great to have you here today. I think this is a topic that doesn't really get spoken about, and I'm really keen to tease out from you through our conversation today things that might be useful to people around the quietness they might recognize in themselves and the quietness they might recognize in others that's maybe been there for almost as long as they can remember, but might also be a newer thing. So welcome.
Yeah, well, it's lovely to be here, and I've been looking forward to this for a while. So I'm really glad to be here and speaking about this topic and kind of, if I can, unraveling some of the mysteries of quiet and introversion for people and talking to those things that you were pointing to around leadership and how sometimes quiet folk get lost in the mix in the workplace.
I'm wondering, as a starting point, Pete, if it might be useful for a bit of kind of context and framing, and for people to feel that they get to know you a little, if you felt comfortable sharing what did lead you into unraveling the myths around this for yourself.
Well, in hindsight, I've always been a quiet person. I was pretty wild when I was a student, but that was, I was acting up really then in amongst my peer group, but I've always been a quiet person. I had a couple of childhood illnesses that knocked me back a bit, and I didn't join in with the rough and tumble at school terribly much. I was brought up in a house with my elderly nana, and little children should be seen but not heard kind of rule in the house. So there were all sorts of forces acting on me from a very early age that kind of determined that I would be quiet and in the background in terms of how I behaved in life. It was really only later in life, I suppose, in my 50s, when I really started seriously looking at, why am I this way? Other people had been commenting on my quietness and why I didn't join in with things, and that got a bit uncomfortable. Didn't like it very much. I was happy with myself, but I wasn't happy about how other people were behaving towards me, which I think is quite common when you're a quiet person. Yeah. And I went off and did the MBTI, Myers-Briggs test, which brought me out as an INTJ F, I think, which is probably the most introverted you can be.
Okay.
And I wore that as a badge for some time, thinking, I've solved this problem now of why I'm so quiet. And of course, the Myers-Briggs is just a measure, it's just a personality test, really. And in the end, it didn't explain my quietness. It just kind of classified it a bit. And I learned that my quiet came from other things that had happened to me much earlier in life. So I've grown to this understanding that you can be misled by the labels a little bit. And if you're a quiet person, I think it's worth you as the individual digging a bit deeper. And if you're in an organization, I think leaders also need to pay attention a bit more and not rely on the profiling to determine how and why a person is the way they are and how they show up at work.
There's so much in all of that, Pete, and I'm holding all sorts of questions, wondering, where do I begin? In the book, you have this really powerful model of an iceberg, and it appears at different sections of the book to be used as an invitation in different ways for people to self-reflect and then reflect on how they might relate to themselves and relate to this concept of quietness. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that to bring it to life.
I think for a lot of quiet people, there's a discomfort in not understanding why you're quiet and not understanding, therefore, other people's responses to you. And the truth of the matter is, with anything else in life and in the coaching world and places like that, there's the thing that's visible, which is the tip of the iceberg. And then there's all the stuff going on underneath the surface that people are unaware of and that you're unaware of until you begin to look at it a little more closely. And what became obvious to me was that people were just seeing my quiet behaviours and making judgments about it, and making comparisons with themselves. And there was some unconscious bias coming out in there as to what was maybe normal in a workplace situation. And therefore, the feedback that I was getting and that I know that other people get is quite disturbing, really, from, as a child, I got "you're away with the fairies" all the time, and some folk get, you're unfocused, you're not fully tuning in on what we're saying. Or typically you take far too long to think about things, and why don't you join in? Well, the truth is you don't join in because actually you're processing very deeply, but at a slower pace than everyone else. And then when you look under the surface, and this is what I encourage leaders to do, you begin to notice the drivers underneath, which there's a surprising range of things that make people go quiet, and it's not all got anything to do with introversion at all. Sometimes people may be having a bad time at home. They may be chronically worried about something. There may be some aspect of neurodivergence in play. There could be chronic pain going on. I'm just touching on a very few things that make people go quiet. There could be a sense that they're being bullied, or there could be a sense that they're deeply masking in order to fit into the workplace. And that's very, very common. And it's very stressful for people who try and change their behaviours to try and fit in. Now, I've only touched on a very few things there, but you already see that what people see on the outside as the behaviours don't reflect what's underneath, and then behave in a totally inappropriate way towards the quiet person who's on the receiving end of all this, both from the outside and their own confusion about it.
Yes, and you speak about the damage that can do for somebody, and of course the impact of that can be sort of further withdrawal and somebody going even more inward because of it.
Yeah, I mean, it turns into stress very rapidly when you're masking all the time, or when you're having to act up, or you're being pushed around a bit and you feel you need to speak up. Your stress levels go up, the stress chemicals kick in, that affects the way you think, you slow down even more. People get more frustrated with you, and ultimately all that stuff affects your biology, your immune system, and can lead to all sorts of problems. And I'm sure we'll touch on that later in the conversation.
Yes. Well, it's something that I think is another interesting bit maybe to bring in at this stage, is the stress that being perceived as being quiet and being labelled or judged because of that can cause, but also this kind of connection to the withdrawal and the quietness being a symptom of stress, and that stress might come from those same factors that could lead to somebody being quiet. They might be related to something else that we wouldn't necessarily associate with withdrawal. And I wonder, because you cover quite a lot in the book about stress and what the impact of that is in terms of when it's prolonged and when it can become chronic, and then of course that links very strongly to burnout, because burnout is the ongoing impact of stress that's sort of cumulatively built up in the system. So I'm curious about that, because I often feel with those that I work with, when I speak to them about their behaviour and what changes they've noticed in the run up to burnout, the quietness is something that tends to be a gradual dialing down, rather than overnight somebody goes from being one way in themselves to to another, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't tend to be flip-flop, does it?
Yeah.
It tends to be gradual.
Yeah, I think that's true. If I can just focus in on one aspect of a typical workplace, you have the kind of socially active people, if you like, the folk that are louder in the conversations, the folk that think more rapidly, the folk that demand quick answers to things. And there's a physiological reason for that in the way they think. And then you have quieter folk that process things much more slowly. The brain chemistry is different in both cases, and that affects a lot of stuff because quieter people's thought processes tend to visit far more areas of the brain. For instance, the processing takes longer. So they end up, a decision's being made at the end of a meeting and they don't feel that they've completely got to the right answer yet.
Yes.
And they get criticism for that, And so you're as a quiet person, you're constantly on this catch up all the time, which is disturbing enough. We're trying to make decisions in a short space of time without other people then telling you, why are you slow in this and why do you need more time? And then trying to explain that gets difficult and that becomes even more stressful. So there's just this quiet withdrawal into the corner, really, that goes on. And I think you're right. And then people, unless they find a way of getting some support with that, or unless they have a sympathetic manager who recognizes what's going on and adapts the culture in some way, because so much of this has got to do with culture in the workplace, then they can get stuck and some people will leave or some people will get ill. It's very rare for a quiet person to protest loudly about these things.
Right.
I encourage quiet people at work to find a buddy, find somebody who's a bit like them and get from that some normalization for the behaviour, and then they can work together to talk about this more openly. Very hard to do it as a singular person. But when you've got company, it's much easier to bring it up in the workplace and maybe get a conversation going about it.
Yes. There's something really significant, I think, about the finding a way to have validated the experience. As you suggested, that normalization of it by finding others, and even if it's not others that they are aware of that are in the workplace setting. But I notice from coaching conversations and clients who've maybe had psychotherapy or counselling, for example, being able to express what they've been experiencing and have somebody hold that and not just dismiss it or criticize them for it. One client comes to mind who particularly struggled for one of the reasons that you have in the book around bearing the weight of two people's workloads, and trying to speak up and say something about that was difficult enough. But then that wasn't met with any level of compassion or willingness to explore what could be done about that. So she kind of took it on herself to then try and cope with the workload as it is anyway. And then when she tried to put boundaries in place for her, of course, she's then not meeting expectations, because if you go from doing two people's jobs to then just doing the one job you're being paid to do, somebody's going to be disappointed. And that disappointment that you then encounter, it's such a vicious circle, isn't it? And as you say, it's the societal part in this, especially when we're in a culture that very much is wanting everything yesterday and things quickly. And that time for processing, the time for sitting, contemplating, reflecting, often gets skipped. Unless a leader appreciates the value that can come from allowing that spaciousness and the quality of thinking that quieter people can then bring, that would make all the difference between lots of mistakes being made when we go off at pace.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. It's an argument I always put to leaders, or often put to leaders, is that if you don't pay attention now to what's going on, you end up spending far more time unraveling all the arguments, disagreements, bad decisions, all the rest of it, that come from not simply allowing enough time for the whole team to process and for everybody to bring their particular insights into the decision-making before you rush off. Brené Brown's got a lovely quote that if you don't pay attention to people's feelings and expectations, you pay a terrible price later on for the kind of consequences that arise from not doing that. And that's quite a powerful message. I enjoy working in situations where I have leaders and managers and quiet people in the same space. I do a lot of group coaching with this and explain a lot about why people have different processing speeds and why people are quiet in the first place, and everything from genetic influences to their upbringing to the kind of sibling structure, the family system they've brought up into childhood illness, and that's even before they're an adult,
Yeah.
And once managers begin to realise what's going on under the iceberg, and they visualise the iceberg, they're kind of going, oh my goodness me, I've been really unfair here, and I should be paying attention to these because I've just expected them to be like me, and that they're
Right.
somehow cognitively inadequate because they're not like me, and actually I need to sit up straight, pay attention, and make some room for this. And there are some examples that I give in the book of large companies that have built in more processing time and who are benefiting from that enormously. But it's all about getting the louder people to sit up and say, why am I talking? Can I just hold back a bit here and let the process continue? Because actually I'll gain from that rather than pushing things to a rapid conclusion.
So powerful, the difference that it can make to bring this in. And it's such valuable work I feel that you're doing in the world. Something struck me about the phrase that you said when you shared some of the things that can happen in childhood. And you said something like, and that's even before they become an adult, the labeling that can go on, not because somebody identifies themselves as being quiet or introverted and has done some kind of profiling tool like you indicated you had at the very beginning of this conversation, but, by being called the quiet one, the shy one, where people start to identify themselves as that. I wonder if there's a little more that you might say to that, because I feel quite often, and this is not for parents to then be hard on themselves, but sometimes it can be really useful for those of us that are bringing up children to recognise the impact of what we say casually, flippantly, here or there, but when it's done repeatedly a lot of the time.
Yeah. I mean, when you're a child, you're in a little bit of a crucible where your personality forms, and the people that are big when you're little have a lot of influence over how you turn out, and you're absolutely right. I mean, my mother used to say, this is Peter, he's terribly shy, all the time. For about 6 years, she's repeated that mantra. So by the time I got to primary school, I was the shy one. The entire village knew me as Peter, the shy boy. And I just kind of went, yeah, okay, I must be, and you carry that into your adult life. The family environment you grow up in, if you have a quiet parent, or grandparent, that can carry through. It's carried through in the genes, particularly if the parent or grandparent has some kind of trauma in their background that's made them quiet. That stays in the genes and gets passed on through to you. So it's a fabulously complex set of conditions that lead to somebody being a quiet person in the first place. And then when they start interacting with other adults and they get the feedback, that can become quite painful. And it's something I deal with in depth in the Quiet Person's Guide, and then deal with in terms of leadership in the Leader's Guide to Working with Quiet People.
I can see how the two books would be very powerful together in the way that they dovetail. Yeah, so I think you could enter in deeper understanding around this with either book, right? Yeah. And go, it doesn't matter where you start.
Yeah.
You could read one and then read the other in either order. I'm wondering, in terms of people that are recognizing and maybe for the first time having that moment of, yes, I identify that there are aspects of me that maybe wouldn't be even as quiet as they are had it not been for, the repetition of what I've been told, or I tell myself, or even announce myself as, because I'm just as epigenetics can play a part in thinking, so too children might have been told, oh, you're just like your aunt, whoever, or just like you. And the way that people will introduce themselves in workplace settings and say, oh, well, I'm quiet, or and actually, is that helping them or hindering them? Maybe a bit of both.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not often useful to say, I'm a complete introvert, I'm an FJ, whatever. That's not often helpful because people often read those things as justifications for not meeting their expectations rather than you talking about who it is you are. That's why I think there's a need for a broader conversation around this. So folk, the entire team and the manager and leaders understand the lexicon of quiet and what all the different aspects are and the role that they play in either, if you like, relieving those conditions or in fact, making them continue in a way that can be quite painful for everybody. So a lot to do with psychological safety in this. And allowing time to think. I mean, there's all the beautiful work by Nancy Klein around time to think. And I encourage people, both in my workshops and when I'm working live, to just every now and again say, right, let's stop. Let's just take a minute to think. And in the end, although it gets some resistance to begin with, everybody appreciates it. It allows the more socially energetic people to slow down and breathe a little bit. And it allows the slower processors, the quiet people with quiet energy, if you like, to catch up in their processing. And then they're ready to start the conversation afresh from a different base point, having had just a minute or two to think about it. And that can begin to accelerate the process of decision making without tripping up the quieter people in the room.
I love that. And it reminds me of a really profound learning I had when I was working with you and we were delivering a workshop together, and noticing in the group that there were different people needing different things in order to be able to process information, make sense of it, and then respond to it with either their own reflections to be shared or questions. And it's something I've since then brought in far more consciously when I'm working with groups, is the opportunity to reflect for everybody in the group so that it benefits all. That's really stayed with me. And I'm thinking about something in the book that you shared around leaders and the protective factor that they can play for people in the team, the need for this protective nature of the responsibility, I guess, that a leader has. When a leader is conscious about this. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that. How can leaders help?
Yeah, I mean, there's several levels to this. One is to learn about this stuff and get a global understanding of what's really going on. But there are easier things as well, like making sure that within your team you've got 2 or 3 people who are really well-trained facilitators who understand the value of not rushing things, who can quietly hold back the more rapid thinkers and allow the space for quieter people to get the space to think, and orchestrate the meeting so that you get to the end of it with a bunch of satisfied people who've all been able to say what they need to say in their own way and at their own pace. And then you make a decision or go out of the meeting without having a terrible mess to clear up. You know, if you're a quiet person and you can't express what you want in that space and time, you come out of the meeting feeling that you've not been able to make a contribution, or you're upset or dissatisfied. And that happens often enough. There's a resentment that builds up. Happens a lot with people pleasers as well. The resentment builds up, because they say yes to other people all the time, don't get what they want, and then they have this terrible turmoil inside that can be incredibly stressful all the time.
Yes.
So it's about tackling it on many levels. And I think, I'm not saying the organization needs to take the whole responsibility for this. I think there are things that quiet people can do for themselves and take responsibility for to make things work better as well.
I wonder if you might feel to say a little bit more about that, because similarly with burnout as something that is systemic, there are things that organizations definitely do need to do and have a responsibility for, but equally the responsibility is not all on the organization. I speak about that a lot. I think that's would be great.
So
Pete.
I think, and this has been tested and we know it's true, if a quiet person gets a buddy or buddies in their team, that helps enormously. It normalizes that feeling of I'm not alone, it's not just me that's thinking this way. So, for instance, when that happens in a meeting, the buddies can help support and amplify each other. And if somebody's struggling to speak and the other person knows that, they can support them. If they share the same values and they have the same views about what ought to be happening, it's easier to play ping pong and get a number of voices going rather than an isolated person speaking up alone. The other thing that quiet people can do is to identify amongst the more socially energized people in the team somebody who shares their values and beliefs about what ought to be happening there, and to say to them, look, sometimes I stumble with this in meetings. If you notice me stumbling, I give you complete permission to step in and say, let me just amplify that and to just take the pressure away for a moment while the quieter person catches their breath.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
It just reminds me of a workshop that I was at a week ago, and the person that facilitated it, right at the very beginning of the workshop, spoke to the group, and it was a group that didn't know each other particularly well. And yet, we typically get a sense of others that, in relation to ourselves within quite a short time space, I think, in groups, right? We work out who is the person that's likely to be the voice that will be heard, and and he asked for everybody to be mindful of all of the companions in the space and to actively consider who might need some encouragement or benefit from a bridge to inclusion. And I thought I'd never heard somebody quite put it that way, and I'm paraphrasing and those aren't his words, and I'm probably not doing it justice in the way that he created it, but it stayed with me in terms of actually as a starting point for meetings and for workshops and trainings and whatever the setting, we can set a tone and remind a group to operate as a group, not just as two horses that lead the pack, or run the herd, That's probably not a very good metaphor. Maybe horses are very good at inclusion, I'm not sure. But I was thinking again about something in the book that you shared about how quieter people are more likely to find it difficult to ask for help. So that idea of approaching people outside of the meeting setting, maybe many of us are working hybrid now, or sometimes even not at water coolers anymore. I was about to say, when we're making a cup of tea, but in the side conversations that happen where we have, the opportunity to speak to people before we have then a group meeting with them, asking for that sort of support.
Yeah.
There was something in the very first episode of this series with Dr. Richard Duggins was about creating burnout-free workspaces. And he talks about how organizations need to lean in more to support versus the individual needing to ask for that support. And I'm wondering, how might leaders support quieter people in feeling safe to ask for help?
Yeah. I think there's a reframe that both ends of the argument, if you like, can think about. And it is that asking for help is not an admission of failure. Asking for help is a statement of courage. It's a statement of integrity. It's a statement of a willingness to learn and grow. And once you get that frame in your head, it does become easier because you've got a logical structure there that says, this is actually a really good thing to do. And if I do it, and I take the step, maybe with a buddy or two, to ask for the help, the person on the other end begins to get a much clearer understanding of what it is you actually require, and is far more able and more informed to step up and give you the help you need. So that's an important reframe, and both sides need to see it and facilitate it. And I do think it's a big part of a responsibility that a quiet person can take, maybe with a bit of support, is realizing that it's not weakness, it's actually integrity and courage and all of those things.
That's so impactful, Pete. And it kind of links to what you said earlier about otherwise the resentment that can build, because I think for people to recognize that in saying how we actually feel, speaking up, we might feel like we're troubling someone. We might feel that we're but actually that trouble that brews is bigger. It's a bit like the rushing ahead and not taking the time for reflection. If we don't share the thing that's otherwise causing distress, the distress somehow then becomes bigger, and the person's going to feel that anyway because, with burnout, quite often there can be a significant amount of resentment that occurs. There's a build-up in the background. Not always, not all people burn out and feel that way about their employer or about other people in their life. But when it is there, it's usually there because of unspoken needs. Yeah. Wow. I wonder, as we kind of move towards the close of our conversation today, the book also has some really powerful tools around nervous system regulation and finding the groundedness, perhaps, to be able to come from that place of courage to then bring oneself forward more. I wonder if you might feel to share a little of that?
I mean, what would the world be like if everybody in the workplace could regulate their emotions well? I think it's all those different types of nervous system firing away, some of which are going at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and they're under deep stress already, and they think rapidly. And then if somebody says, can you just chill out or slow down a bit, then you get this terrible reaction to it, and that's not the way to do it. And then you get the quieter people who are bubbling away. I just wish I'd got the courage to step up. But as soon as they try to, the stress system kicks in and quietens them down again. So there's a lot to be said for, and some companies do it by doing education around nervous system regulation so that everybody understands what's going on when they get that whoosh, and the whoosh is the cue, actually, not to rush into anything, but to pay attention and notice that you need to leave a bit of space. It almost goes back to Viktor Frankl, and, the space you need between action and reaction is the place where you make quality decisions, and if you identify you need that space and take it, and everybody in the team knows that, they can all go, right, actually what we need to do now is stop just for a few seconds, everybody gets their breath back, stress levels come down, and then proceed. Yeah. If you look at the special forces, if you look at people that are working in high stress situations, negotiators, they've all learned these skills. So when somebody comes up and kind of sticks a gun in their face or whatever, they are able to stay absolutely calm. And what comes out the other end of that transaction is much safer and cleaner and more effective than if they'd gone into panic mode. And I think that's what happens is, for one reason or another, people fly off the handle in a small way or in a big way. And then once you've done that, it turns everybody's banging into each other with their own nervous systems firing. So I always recommend, let's do some training around this, folks. Let's begin to understand what a stress reaction is, what the stress chemicals do, what cortisol and adrenaline do, which immediately shut down your prefrontal cortex, is where you do all your logical thinking. So your ability to think straight goes out the window. It's the same as road rage. It's exactly the same mechanism. When we recognize what's happening, and we can recognize, usually at the base of your neck, the whoosh feeling, where your blood pressure starts to go up and everything else, instead of rushing forward, you breathe. And there are in the book, there's many also descriptions of breathing exercises and things that you can use.
Yeah. Thank you, Pete. I think that's really useful, because it's something that we all have on board, like the ability to do that. It's like we just need to remember it in the moment often. And there was something that you wrote about that I hadn't come across before, which was about tracing the underside of your teeth and like creating like a little rhythm with it. And I thought, gosh, that's so powerful, because it distracts you from the thing that would otherwise be causing the panic in that moment. It brings in a rhythm. It's not like how many breaths do I need to take and how long do I have to hold them? It's like you create your own rhythm. And it's so subtle that nobody else would notice it, which I thought.
It's a little biofeedback loop, because when you're thinking, your tongue's actually saying the words in tiny, tiny and fractional ways. And if you just do that and still your tongue, there's a reverse feedback that kind of quietens your brain down a little bit. When I'm breathing out in a breathing exercise, I touch my tongue to the back of my teeth, and it just helps settle the system a bit.
Yeah, really, really useful. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you today, Pete. I'm so grateful for all of the different things you've touched on, that you've expanded on. I think it's been a really useful conversation. I'm really grateful for the time. If there was one thing that you could have known, maybe a younger version of you, what would you wish you could have gifted yourself, perhaps?
The gift is that it's all right to be quiet. It's okay to be a quiet person. You have many skills, and the biggest gift of all is thinking about things for longer than other people do, if only you get the space, to be able to do that. But I think people worry about being quiet, and actually, fine, don't lose your quiet nature. It's incredibly valuable. The world needs quiet people right now. It really does.
Thank you, Pete.
It's been a pleasure. Always great talking to you.
Talk soon, hopefully. Likewise.
Yeah, thanks, Jayne.
Thank you for listening to Burnout to Brilliance. I hope today's conversation offered you insight, comfort, or a spark of inspiration to carry into your week. If you enjoyed the episode, please do take a moment to follow the podcast. Share it with someone who might benefit, write a review, and connect with me, Jayne Morris MCC and Balanceology over on LinkedIn or at balanceology.uk, where you'll find more tools, training, and community support. Remember, burnout isn't the end of your story. It's an invitation to rewrite it. Until next time, sending you my warmest wishes. Please do stay connected. And together, let's keep creating the communities of care that have the real power to help us collectively move from burnout to brilliance.